You're listening to the Bare Metal Cyber Prepcast, created to help you succeed in your educational journey. Learn more at baremetalcyber.com, where additional prepcasts, books, and training materials await. Let's get started. Cookies remain the most familiar form of online tracking, but the variety within them can be confusing. First-party cookies are created by the site a user is visiting and often provide useful functions such as keeping a shopping cart active or remembering login status. Third-party cookies, by contrast, are placed by outside domains like advertising networks, enabling tracking across many sites. Session cookies expire when a browser is closed, while persistent cookies remain stored on the device until deleted or expired. Each type serves different purposes, from convenience to profiling, and regulators now view them through the lens of privacy risk. For example, a first-party session cookie that saves a temporary form entry is relatively low risk, while a persistent third-party cookie that logs browsing behavior across hundreds of websites raises significant privacy questions. Understanding this taxonomy is the first step in appreciating why laws and enforcement strategies treat cookies differently. Pixels and web beacons represent another category of tracking tools that often escape user attention. A pixel is a tiny, often invisible image embedded in a web page or email that sends a signal back to a server when it is loaded. These trackers allow companies to measure when emails are opened or when specific content is viewed, providing powerful insight into consumer engagement. From a regulatory perspective, pixels are treated like other trackers because they collect behavioral data that can be tied to individuals. Imagine receiving a newsletter. The act of opening it might quietly notify a marketing platform of your interest, adding you to a list for targeted ads. While valuable to businesses, such tracking can feel intrusive if undisclosed, leading to requirements for clear notices and, in some jurisdictions, explicit consent. Mobile applications rely heavily on software development kits, or SDKs, which serve as embedded channels for telemetry collection. An SDK is essentially a pre-built set of tools added by developers to handle functions like analytics, advertising, or crash reporting. When an SDK is integrated, it often funnels data about user activity, device attributes, or location back to the SDK provider. For example, a fitness app may use an SDK to track exercise patterns, but the SDK may also collect advertising identifiers or location data that gets shared beyond the app. The challenge for privacy compliance is that SDKs operate inside the app, making it difficult for users to distinguish between the app provider and third-party services. Regulators now expect businesses to treat SDKs like other trackers, disclose their use, secure consent where required, and ensure contractual limits on how collected data is used downstream. Device identifiers play a particularly important role in mobile and cross-platform tracking. Smartphones, tablets, and other connected devices generate unique advertising IDs or device IDs that allow recognition across apps and sessions. Unlike cookies, which can often be deleted, device identifiers are persistent until reset manually. Advertising networks rely on them to follow user behavior across contexts, stitching together detailed profiles. Consider downloading several unrelated apps, each sharing your advertising ID with different partners. Together, these signals enable a single advertising company to understand your preferences with surprising accuracy. For regulators, device identifiers are a flashpoint because consumers rarely realize how persistent and widely shared they are. Laws now demand clearer disclosures and, in some cases, opt-in consent before these identifiers can be linked to targeted advertising or sensitive data. Browser fingerprinting is an even more subtle tracking method, relying on the unique configuration of a user's device. By collecting signals such as screen resolution, installed fonts, language settings, and browser version, trackers can create a probabilistic identity that distinguishes one user from millions. Even if cookies are deleted or identifiers reset, the combination of fingerprinting data can re-identify individuals with striking accuracy. For example, the specific mix of a rare font set operating system version, and browser plugins might be unique enough to identify you. Unlike cookies, users have little ability to block fingerprinting, which is why regulators treat it as a particularly intrusive practice. It demonstrates how tracking technology evolves to bypass controls, forcing privacy laws to adapt with broader definitions that include any mechanism used to uniquely identify or track individuals online. Server-side tagging is a newer model that shifts data collection from client browsers to controlled servers. Instead of allowing multiple third-party scripts to load directly on a user's browser, organizations collect data themselves and then relay it selectively to partners. This approach reduces exposure to rogue scripts, but raises new questions about consent enforcement. If a company gathers all browsing data server-side, it must still honor user choices about whether advertising or analytics tags can be triggered. The benefit is tighter control and better security, but the responsibility is also greater. Businesses must ensure that technical enforcement aligns with the consent signals users provide. For learners, think of server-side tagging as a funnel. It consolidates the flow of data into one channel, but the organization controlling the funnel must take extra care to respect user rights and preferences. Tag management systems, or TMS platforms, act as centralized control points for loading scripts, trackers, and tags on websites. Instead of embedding each tracker individually, businesses use a TMS to decide dynamically which tags to deploy. This offers efficiency and flexibility, but it also places responsibility squarely on configuration. A poorly configured TMS may load unnecessary trackers, or worse, fail to block them when users decline consent. Regulators now view TMS as a natural enforcement mechanism. If a company promises users they can opt out of advertising cookies, the TMS should be configured to prevent those tags from firing. For businesses, TMS becomes both a tool and a test. It enables compliance when managed carefully, but it exposes risk when treated casually. The lesson is that technical control points must mirror the promises made in policies and consent banners. Cross-context behavioral advertising is one of the most debated practices in privacy law. It refers to targeting users based on data collected from their behavior across multiple sites or services, often using cookies, pixels, or device identifiers. Targeted advertising, as a broader term, includes personalization based on data collected within a single context, such as showing a user product recommendations based on their shopping history in one store. Regulators increasingly require companies to distinguish between these practices because cross-context tracking carries greater privacy risks. Imagine browsing a health information site and later receiving ads for medication on a completely unrelated platform. This linkage is what triggers regulatory concern. By differentiating between targeted ads within one context and those stitched together across many, laws help consumers understand when their data is being used in ways that feel unexpected or intrusive. Contextual advertising provides a lower-risk alternative to behavioral tracking. Instead of following users across sites, contextual ads are based solely on the content being viewed. For example, someone reading a recipe for pasta might see an ad for olive oil because the context, not their profile, drives the placement. This model aligns more closely with user expectations and avoids the complex profiling that raises regulatory scrutiny. While contextual advertising is often less precise in targeting than behavioral models, it is increasingly promoted as a privacy-friendly approach that balances business goals with consumer comfort. Regulators recognize contextual ads as outside the scope of many tracking restrictions, making them a safer option for organizations wary of compliance pitfalls. For learners, the contrast illustrates how advertising models can achieve different outcomes depending on how much personal data they rely on. Sensitive categories of data collected online demand stricter rules. When trackers collect or infer information about health, financial status, sexual orientation, or children, regulators impose heightened limits. The concern is that misuse of such data can lead to discrimination, embarrassment, or harm. For example, if a tracker infers that a user is researching fertility treatments and then shares this with advertisers, the consequences could include invasive marketing or even exposure of private health struggles. Laws in states like California and Washington specifically call out sensitive categories as requiring explicit consent before collection or sharing. This demonstrates that not all tracking is treated equally. While browsing history about shopping preferences may be less regulated, anything tied to sensitive attributes is scrutinized much more closely. Businesses must therefore classify data carefully and apply stricter standards when sensitive signals are in play. Notice at collection is a recurring requirement that ensures transparency before tracking occurs. Instead of burying disclosures deep in privacy policies, businesses must present clear, timely information at the point of data collection. For example, a cookie banner must appear when a site first loads, explaining that tracking will occur and offering choices. On mobile, an in-app notice might inform users that location data is being collected for advertising purposes. The idea is to avoid surprise by aligning notice with the moment when data leaves a user's control. Regulators emphasize that notice must be specific about what data is collected, why, and how it will be used. From a learner's perspective, think of notice at collection as the digital equivalent of a cashier telling you the price before ringing up a purchase. It provides context so you can make an informed decision before committing. Consent and opt-out paradigms vary significantly across jurisdictions. In Europe, the GDPR requires prior opt-in consent for most cookies and trackers, meaning users must agree before data is collected. In the United States, most state privacy laws rely on opt-out frameworks, allowing data collection by default but requiring businesses to honor consumer requests to stop certain practices. This difference reflects deeper cultural and legal traditions. Europe emphasizes individual rights from the start, while U.S. law balances business interests with reactive consumer choice. For businesses operating globally, the challenge is harmonization, creating systems that can handle both opt-in and opt-out without fragmenting user experience. For learners, the takeaway is that consent is not one-size-fits-all. Understanding local paradigms is critical to designing compliant and user-friendly tracking practices. Universal opt-out and preference signals are gaining traction as a way to standardize consumer choice. The Global Privacy Control, or GPC, is one such signal that can be set in a browser to automatically inform websites that a user does not want their data sold or shared. State laws like California's CPRA require businesses to honor these signals as valid opt-out requests, even if the user does not manually click on a site's "Do Not Sell" link. This shifts the burden away from consumers having to navigate multiple sites and toward businesses to respect a single, universal expression of choice. For learners, universal signals represent a turning point. They transform fragmented, site-by-site control into a streamlined mechanism that better aligns with real user behavior and expectations. Children's online tracking is subject to some of the strictest boundaries. The Children's Online Privacy Protection Act requires verifiable parental consent before collecting personal data from children under 13, and state laws often extend similar protections. Verifiable consent might involve methods such as small credit card charges, government ID verification, or live video calls with parents. The goal is to ensure that companies cannot simply rely on a child's click to gather sensitive information. Imagine a game app trying to collect location data from a 10-year-old. Without parental authorization, this is prohibited. These heightened standards reflect the view that children deserve stronger protections against exploitation and profiling. For learners, children's tracking laws are a vivid example of how privacy frameworks adapt to protect vulnerable groups with rules far stricter than those that apply to adults. For more cyber-related content and books, please check out cyberauthor.me. Also, there are other prepcasts on cybersecurity and more at baremetalcyber.com. State privacy laws increasingly require disclosures when tracking data is sold, shared, or used for targeted advertising. These disclosures must go beyond vague statements and clearly inform individuals about whether their browsing behavior or app usage is monetized. For example, California's law obligates businesses to state whether they sell or share personal information. even when the exchange is for value other than money, such as analytics insights. This transparency is meant to give people the context to decide whether they are comfortable using a service. Imagine learning that a meditation app shares anonymized stress level data with advertisers for targeting campaigns. You may weigh that knowledge differently when deciding to sign up. Regulators insist that this disclosure be prominently placed and written in accessible language, reinforcing the principle that individuals should not need legal expertise to understand how their data is used. Placement of opt-out mechanisms is another area where regulators have grown precise. Many state laws require that "do not sell or share my information" links appear prominently on website homepages and app landing screens. The placement cannot be hidden in submenus or require multiple clicks to find, because that would undermine usability. Standards also address user interface design, mandating that links be conspicuous and phrased in plain English. For learners, it is useful to think of these rules like safety signs. Just as fire exits must be clearly marked and unobstructed, opt-out links must be visible and frictionless. This ensures that individuals can act on their choices without navigating a maze of confusing menus, keeping the balance of power in their hands. Dark patterns have emerged as a critical focus of online tracking regulation. These are design tactics that manipulate or pressure users into consenting, such as using pre-checked boxes, confusing double negatives, or making opt-outs disproportionately difficult compared to opt-ins. Laws now explicitly prohibit such practices, requiring that consent flows be fair, clear, and symmetrical. For example, if accepting cookies takes 1 click, declining them should not take 5. Consider an e-commerce site that makes the Accept All button large and brightly colored, while burying the Decline option in tiny text. That is a textbook dark pattern. Regulators view such designs as deceptive, and enforcement actions increasingly target them. For learners, dark patterns demonstrate how user interface choices can become legal liabilities when they compromise the authenticity of user consent. Universal opt-out signals are rapidly becoming mandatory, especially under state privacy frameworks. These signals, like global privacy control, communicate a user's decision across sites automatically, sparing individuals from having to click opt-out repeatedly. Businesses must configure their systems to detect and honor these signals without adding friction, such as forcing users to create accounts or click through multiple confirmations. For example, if your browser is set to broadcast GPC, a compliant retailer must immediately stop sharing your data for advertising without asking you again. The expectation is frictionless enforcement, meaning the user's choice should be respected seamlessly. This shift reduces the burden on consumers and ensures more consistent application of privacy rights across digital environments. It also raises the compliance bar for businesses, requiring technical readiness to interpret and act on signals received. Cookie banners have evolved into detailed consent tools rather than perfunctory warnings. Regulators expect banners to include specific content elements, such as an explanation of what categories of cookies are used, whether they are necessary or optional, and what purposes they serve. Users should be given granular choices, allowing them to accept analytics cookies while declining advertising cookies, for example. Imagine loading a news site and seeing a banner that lets you toggle off personalized ads but keep cookies that remember your login. This level of choice reflects a move toward meaningful control, not just symbolic acknowledgement. From a learner's perspective, cookie banners illustrate how the principle of informed consent is operationalized in everyday digital experiences. They are now viewed not as legal shields for companies, but as central gateways to user empowerment. Sensitive data tracking demands explicit consent under many frameworks. This includes precise location information, biometric identifiers, or online behavior linked to health and sexuality. Regulators classify these categories as requiring heightened care because of the potential for harm if misused. For example, using location data to infer that someone visited a fertility clinic or a substance abuse center is considered highly sensitive and cannot be processed without explicit permission. Businesses must design systems that identify when such data is being collected and halt processing unless opt-in consent is given. The bar here is not implied acknowledgement or opt-out. It is active, informed choice. This reflects an ethical as well as legal recognition that not all data is created equal, and the stakes of misuse are significantly higher in sensitive contexts. Retention limits for identifiers, logs, and derived audience segments are another emerging requirement. Laws emphasize that data used for tracking should not be kept indefinitely, but instead deleted once its business purpose has been fulfilled. For example, an advertising platform may set a policy to delete device identifiers after 12 months unless the user renews consent. Retention controls reduce the risk of old data being repurposed in ways never anticipated or exposed in breaches. Learners should understand that retention is not just about efficiency, it is about accountability. By limiting how long identifiers and logs live, organizations demonstrate that they treat personal data as a perishable asset rather than a commodity to be hoarded indefinitely. Vendor and sub-processor governance is essential in the ad tech and analytics ecosystem, where multiple parties often handle the same data. A single website visit may trigger dozens of third-party requests, each collecting identifiers or transmitting logs. State laws now expect businesses to exercise control over this chain by conducting due diligence, requiring contractual safeguards, and monitoring vendor practices. For example, if a publisher allows an analytics firm to install tracking pixels, the publisher must ensure the firm is not secretly reselling the data. Vendor oversight turns passive data sharing into active governance, where the business maintains responsibility for what happens to user data even after it leaves its servers. Contractual flowdowns extend these obligations to every link in the data sharing chain. Contracts must restrict vendors and sub-processors from using tracking data for their own purposes, mandate deletion upon termination, and prohibit onward disclosure without authorization. Consider an advertiser contracting with a data management platform, which in turn uses a cloud provider. Each step must include flowdown terms to ensure that restrictions apply equally throughout the chain. Without this structure, data can drift into secondary markets outside the user's awareness. Flowdown contracts create a lattice of accountability, making sure that the promises made to consumers are enforced across all business relationships tied to their data. Security overlays are critical for protecting tracking data, which often includes unique identifiers that can be linked back to individuals. Laws increasingly require businesses to implement access controls, encryption in transit and at rest, and regular monitoring of tracking infrastructure. For example, tag management systems must be secured so that unauthorized scripts cannot be injected. Without such safeguards, attackers could hijack tracking mechanisms to skim payment data or spread malware. From a learner's perspective, this demonstrates that privacy and security are inseparable. Controlling how data is used for advertising is meaningless if the systems themselves are vulnerable to exploitation. Robust security overlays make the tracking ecosystem more resilient and trustworthy. Misconfigurations and rogue scripts represent real-world risks in online tracking, and incident response plans must now account for them. A simple error in a tag management system can result in data flowing to unauthorized parties, while malicious actors may insert unauthorized JavaScript to siphon off sensitive information. Businesses must have processes to detect, investigate, and remediate these issues quickly. For example, a retailer might run automated scans to ensure that only approved trackers are firing on its site, and if a rogue script is detected, remove it immediately while notifying affected users. These scenarios illustrate that privacy compliance is not static documentation. It is active vigilance against evolving technical risks. Record-keeping is another cornerstone of accountability. Companies must maintain detailed logs of consent decisions, changes to tracking systems, and the history of disclosures. These records are critical during audits or investigations, demonstrating that consent was properly obtained and honored. For instance, a business facing scrutiny from a regulator can point to time-stamped consent logs and version histories of cookie banners as evidence of compliance. Without such records, even well-intentioned practices may be impossible to prove. Learners should see this as part of the broader accountability trend. Compliance is not only about doing the right thing, but also about documenting it in ways that can withstand external review. Metrics provide insight into whether consent and tracking systems are working as intended. Companies are expected to monitor consent rates, analyze whether universal signals are being honored consistently, and check that policy commitments are being met. For example, if a company notices unusually high acceptance rates for cookie banners, it may investigate whether the design unintentionally nudges users unfairly. Metrics also highlight compliance drift, where promises on paper no longer match reality in practice. By turning consent into a measurable process, businesses gain both operational visibility and regulatory defensibility. Metrics transform abstract privacy principles into tangible performance indicators that can be tracked and improved over time. Program design alignment integrates all these elements into a cohesive framework. Notices, consent flows, cookie banners, vendor contracts, and technical enforcement mechanisms must all reinforce one another. A gap in any part of the system undermines the entire effort. For example, a company might publish a notice promising opt-outs, but if its tag management system still fires advertising cookies regardless, the program is non-compliant. True alignment means consistency across legal, technical, and operational layers. For learners, this reflects a simple but powerful lesson. Privacy programs succeed not through isolated controls but through integrated design. When notices match technology and contracts enforce promises, tracking compliance becomes sustainable and credible. Thanks for tuning in to the Bare Metal Cyber Prepcast, your trusted source for cybersecurity news and insights. Remember to subscribe at baremetalcyber.com so you never miss an update. And visit cyberauthor.me for best-selling cybersecurity books that equip you with expert knowledge. Until next time, stay secure and stay vigilant.